The Last of Us 2 has officially been revealed as a complete and total scam. Not only is it a shitty game with terrible writing, but you got completely ripped off by Neil Druckmann and Naughty Dog. Because now the multiplayer for The Last of Us Part 2 has been canceled. Well, it was actually supposed to be a standalone game, so they were going to charge you another $70 for the multiplayer mode of The Last of Us Part 2, so it would have been a scam and a ripoff anyway, whether the game happened or not. Unless it went free to play, there's a chance they would have done that, but it would have been some terrible live service trash anyway, and they even admitted that in their blog post, that they actually locked the thread down to on Twitter, because you know Naughty Dog, they can't handle criticism. You know, when all that stuff was coming out about The Last of Us 2, and the terrible writing that game had, they try to shut down any discussions about that. Anything that makes them look bad, they get really upset and don't like any criticism against them at all, because they're Naughty Dog. Clearly, there's a lot of sensitive people that work for that company that can't handle any type of criticism whatsoever. But yeah, their main justification for canceling this game is quite literally that the game was too big and ambitious that it would have taken away from the other games that they wanted to develop, so they canceled it because it was just too great of a game to put out there. And yeah, we want to be a game that makes single-player games, not live services, so if we did this, we would have had to release it and then support it for years and years and years and years and years, and we couldn't do anything else during that time period because, you know, Naughty Dog is such a small indie studio that doesn't have the resources to support multiple projects at once, even though their publisher, Sony, is one of the largest game publishers in the world, the largest console manufacturer in the world. It's like, if that was a main concern, that, like, you should have known that when you first developed the game on what you wanted the game to be, and if that was such a huge problem, and if that was something that you didn't want to do, then you shouldn't have done it in the first place. Just release a regular goddamn multiplayer mode for The Last of Us 2, just like you did for The Last of Us 1, and everyone loved Last of Us 1 multiplayer. At least a lot of people did. It wasn't just your standard thrown together multiplayer mode for the sake of having multiplayer. It was actually a fully fleshed out and very enjoyable online experience. And it wasn't a live service. Why does every game have to be this live service that gets supported for years and years and years and years and years? Like, just because that's a trend that's been going on doesn't mean that it needs to be this huge live service thing that gets like 5+ years of development for, and is a game that keeps getting updated and supported over time. Like, before like 2013, 2014, multiplayer games were not live services. They just released the multiplayer. Maybe there was like DLC that came out here and there, but they weren't really live services. When a game came out, that's pretty much what it was, and you didn't have to keep supporting it for years on end after release. Like, that's just something that's just started in recent years, but multiplayer games were plenty profitable before then. So why is it like just the assumption that if a game has any online elements to it, that it needs to just be like the main focus of a developer studio for like 5 fucking years? Like, what? That's not what you guys did 10 years ago for The Last of Us 1. And again, it was a lot of fun, and they definitely made a lot of money off of that mode being part of the game. So I don't want to hear that bullshit, that it had to have been this big, grand, fucking MMO, whatever the fuck they were going for. Like, no, they could have just done what they did before. Have a couple of fun game modes like Team Deathmatch or whatever the hell, and just expand upon the first multiplayer and, you know, use the improved gameplay elements from Part 2, because that was a big strong suit in that game, despite the writing flaws and just the entire narrative falling apart. It had improved on the overall gameplay of The Last of Us 1 quite a bit. Not improved enough, though, to warrant the removal of half of the game, because half of what was in Last of Us 1 was not in Part 2, which was the multiplayer. Objectively speaking, whatever you think about the story of The Last of Us 2, whatever you think about the gameplay of The Last of Us 2, The Last of Us Part 1, despite coming out 7 years earlier on a previous console generation, had way more content and was a much better value than Part 2. And it doesn't really matter if you personally didn't like the multiplayer or didn't play the multiplayer, because, again, there are a lot of people that did. I can understand if it's a game like Spec Ops The Line, for example. That's a game that had a multiplayer mode, but it was basically some slapped-on bullshit that nobody cared about. So if they announced a sequel to Spec Ops The Line, and it was single-player only, nobody would care because that's not what that series is really known for. So there are some examples where if a game had multiplayer but omits the multiplayer in the next game, it's perfectly fine. But when we're talking about factions for Last of Us, that was almost as big and impactful as the groundbreaking single-player campaign. It's not like I'm talking out of my asshole because literally Naughty Dog was planning on building an entire fucking game around factions until they canceled it yesterday. So, yeah, I just love it though. Their whole excuse when not having multiplayer for part 2 was that they were going to make it a separate thing, and now that's canceled. It's like, wow, what a huge fucking scam that was. And a complete waste of time. I feel like that whole comment that they made, though, saying we can only do live service or single player, we want to be a single player studio, that was just to keep, like, the core audience happy and not throw pitchforks at them, because it's, like, the cool thing now to hate on multiplayer and hate on live service and to love single player. You know, that's, like, what most of the, like, the most vocal people on Twitter advocate for, is like to move away from live service and to go to single player. So they want to act like this was a pro-consumer move that they did right here, when it's really just incompetence and straight up stupidity from Naughty Dog and Sony. And this is significant because we're not talking about Bend Studio or some smaller developer team at Sony. We're talking about the #1 and most profitable studio that Sony owns. Just a really bad look. Makes Sony look like a cheap brand, not one of great prestige, when they can't even handle, like, the main game that was being developed. Because, like, Sony was making a huge push towards live service, and the fact that their biggest live service project has just been scrapped, it's not... It seems like Sony doesn't really know what they're doing. But at the same time, a big part of me is happy that this game got canceled, because it was just a multiplayer mode for a game that got spun off into its own game that they likely would have charged another $60, $70 for, and probably added in a bunch of shitty cosmetic battle pass bullshit. It's like, no, we have enough games like that, so I'm actually happy that this happened, but it's not like I have any skin in the game anyway. I don't have a PS5, never will, so it is what it is. Doesn't affect me in the slightest. I guess, you know, I'm on PC, so maybe eventually that would have come out on PC. Either way, I wasn't really excited about a huge fucking live service thing when I just wanted, like, a regular multiplayer mode anyway. It didn't have to be this big fucking thing, but nobody should be celebrating this either. Because at the end of the day, they scrapped the entire multiplayer for The Last of Us 2 because of this canceled game. So I don't want to hear from the Sony fanboys. There's no way to justify this at all. Also, if you ever played Doom Eternal and you thought that that was okay for taking the multiplayer out of that, then I don't want to hear from you either, because you're just as much of a clown, probably a bigger clown, than anybody defending this shit from Sony and Naughty Dog. Doom and multiplayer were always synonymous with each other, and literally the word deathmatch comes from Doom. So it's not like, oh, it's just a put-together thing for Doom. No, the multiplayer was just as important for Doom as the single player, and that's not even close to being up for debate. The removal of the multiplayer in Doom Eternal is indefensible. The only people who do defend it are complete shills and clowns, and not real Doom fans. Anyway, what do you guys think about this news with The Last of Us Online being canceled, and how they just completely pulled the rug underneath the people who thought that factions not being a part of The Last of Us 2 meant that we were going to get something bigger and better with this online standalone game? They somehow made a bad game retroactively worse than it already was. But I can't say I'm shocked, considering other terrible moves that Naughty Dog has made over the years, like having the Nathan Drake collection, not including the multiplayer of Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3, the PS5 and PC version of Uncharted 4, also not having multiplayer. Like, these are important parts of the game that they just say, fuck you, we're not going to include it for bullshit reasons. Like, when they didn't include Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3 multiplayer, they said, oh, it's because we don't want to split the community between PS3 and PS4. But then they shut the PS3 servers down a couple years later. So this is just another example of how awful Naughty Dog is, and how a once beloved and trusted game developer is nothing but a bunch of con artists and scammers.